in the black community. This started long before cell phones started capturing on camera, right? Like, how far back do you go with this?
Yeah, well, I think you have to go back to slavery. The reason why young men of color are at risk in too many of our streets is that there is a presumption of dangerousness and guilt that gets assigned to people of color. And we act on that presumption in ways that are sometimes violent. And these police officers are reacting to this narrative of racial difference, this presumption of guilt and dangerousness that you can't understand unless you think about the legacy of slavery. Even before slavery, the genocide of indigenous people in this country, where we began to shape our whole worldview based on color. I mean, for me, the great evil of American slavery wasn't involuntary servitude, it wasn't forced labor. It was really this ideology of white supremacy we made up to make ourselves feel comfortable with enslavement. We said that black people are different, they've got these deficits, etc. We're actually civilizing them by enslaving them. And that was the great evil of American slavery, and we never dealt with that.
So it's easy for me to fall into the trap of saying, look, slavery happened so long ago that I don't feel any relationship to it. But in your family, you're much more connected to it than I realized even possible in today's time.
Well, that's right. No, my grandmother was the daughter of people who were raised by, who were born into slavery. I mean, my great-grandparents were enslaved, but I think for all of us, the legacy of slavery is still around us. Because if the great evil of American slavery was this narrative of racial difference, when we read the 13th Amendment, it doesn't talk about that ideology of white supremacy. It talks about involuntary servitude and forced labor. So we don't actually end slavery in the worst part of slavery in 1865. Slavery doesn't end, it just evolves. It turns into decades where we use that same narrative to justify terrorism perpetrated against African Americans throughout this country in brutal public spectacle lynchings. What we did to African Americans between the end of Reconstruction and World War II rivals anything we read about in the Mideast today perpetrated by ISIS. We strung people up, we mutilated them, we set them on fire, we shot them 100 times, we cut off parts of their body and took it home as souvenirs. And then we didn't talk about it. We just sort of moved it indoors and created a criminal justice system that perpetuated that same narrative. Even civil rights. We haven't dealt with the hard parts of our history of segregation. We like to celebrate the civil rights movement. We talk about it like it's this triumph of heroic black people doing extraordinary things. And heroic black people did do some extraordinary things, but there was opposition to civil rights. There was resistance to civil rights by elected officials. And if you don't know that resistance story, if you don't know how that continued past the 1960s into the 1970s, you can't understand mass incarceration and excessive punishment today. And at each point of these historical eras, people who identified with law enforcement, they were the foot soldiers empowered to sustain this racial hierarchy. They were the ones who were maintaining the rules of slavery. They tracked the future.
Explicitly or implicitly? Do you think they knew that's one of my jobs here?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, during the era of slavery, it was the law enforcement that would chase the fugitive slaves into the North and bring them back. Now, they were the ones that would enforce the conflicts. During the era of terrorism, there'd be some accusation of the crime, and the sheriff would make the arrest, and then he would open up the jail doors to the mob who would engage in these acts of violence. There's been this complicity between law enforcement and this history in mass incarceration. In our contemporary era, it is the police who are being looked to keep the public safe, but more than that, to sustain these dynamics, to resist any kind of challenge to this identity that we've grown up with. And so we need, in America, truth and reconciliation. We need to kind of reshape our identity. I'm not interested in punishing people for slavery or punishing people for terrorism. I'm not interested in punishing people for segregation or even punishing people for police violence. I'm interested in getting us to a place where we're feeling something that looks more like freedom and justice. And we can't get there without truth and reconciliation. Go to Germany, where in less than 80 years, that nation has recovered from the Holocaust, not by denying it, but by putting markers and stones at the home of every Jewish family in Berlin, by directing people who come to Germany to Auschwitz and the camps to reflect soberly on the history of the Holocaust. In America, we do the opposite. We don't talk about slavery. So now that we're in this period of our history where 1 in 3 black males is expected to go to jail or prison, where people of color are menaced and targeted on the streets of our country, the question really is, when will we stop? When will we change direction? When will we confront this legacy that we have created in America, by our inaction, by our silence.
You're talking about much broader racial issues. Is that because of a moment in time that we're in? Is something happening now where there's a chance for this conversation?
Actually, not for me. I think for me, it's in recognizing that we can only get so far in the legal courts, in the legal system. We've got to change.
That's a symptom of the bigger problem.
It's exactly right. We've got to change the broader environment. We've got to actually create some movement in these spaces. So I go into courts and I say, this county underrepresents people of color. You don't let black people serve on juries. I go into courts and say there are no people of color in the prosecutorial